Should you just wait for the PS6? The numbers are in and Sony's gotta be pretty happy. And here's what's leaving PS Plus. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I spent my weekend playing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game with my friends, and it is really, really good. I have my review at the end, so if you want to hear my thoughts on that game, stick around till the end. Alright, so with all these rumors of the PS5 Pro and Slim going around the internet, with the PS5 Slim coming out later this year and the PS5 Pro coming out next year, it's very clear that this generation is pretty different from anything we've seen before. Traditionally, like with the PS1, 2, 3, and even 4, the way things would work is you would get one model at launch, and then a couple years into the console's life cycle, you would get a slim model that was cheaper to buy but also had a few improvements over the original model of the console. I mean, we even saw this with the Nintendo Switch, where we got the main Nintendo Switch at launch, and then a couple years in they released the Switch Lite, which was cheaper because it didn't have the TV features of the Switch, but a lot of people ended up liking it more. And then after the slim model, with some of these consoles like the PS3 specifically, you would see the super slim model, which is the worst one, I would say, out of the three PS3s. I'm partial to the launch one, the Spider-Man font one, but I did like the PS3 Slim. I just really did not like that top loading drive that they put in the Super Slim, and we even kind of saw that with the Xbox 360e, which was kind of in the same design language as the Xbox One, but overall was not really that good. The big wrinkle with how things work happened in the PS4 and Xbox One generation, where Sony and Microsoft released the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, and the reason they ended up needing to release those consoles was because that generation started pretty late. If you remember, there was a recession around 2008, and that caused the generation of consoles that was happening then, the 360 and PS3 generation, to extend to be a lot longer than was initially planned. So the hardware that was designed to come out earlier than it actually did was just sat on by Sony and Microsoft, and then by the time it was eventually released, it wasn't that big of a jump over what we already had, and compared to PCs and other technology at the time, it was pretty far behind. So when the slim models of these consoles came out, the Xbox actually did get a 20% performance boost. You didn't really see it in a ton of games. It might result in like 1 or 2 frames difference, but where you really saw it was in Xbox 360 emulation, which is cool. But the PS4 Slim was essentially the same console, just with a bigger hard drive and a new look. So with all that in mind, they realized they had a few years left in the generation, so instead of rushing the PS5 and Xbox Series X, both companies ended up releasing the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Going into this generation though, the launch model of the PlayStation 5 was actually very powerful, right? And it still is. We're seeing a few games come out now that take advantage of the hardware and they're running at 30 FPS, but that really does seem like publishers rushing a game out just to meet their quarterly deadline or whatever, so they can say they got X number of revenue in this period of time. I totally believe with games like Dead Space, Jedi Survivor, and Final Fantasy 16, if they had gotten more time in the oven, then they would have been able to run at 60 FPS when they launched, because both do have performance modes that are able to hit 60 FPS. It's just when you get to the unoptimized parts of the game, it drops pretty dramatically down. So you could see where they need to optimize the game to get it running at 60 all the time. Even when you're talking about loading in a new portion of the level and you're dropping down to like 55 FPS, I think that's reasonable. I would obviously like it to stay at a locked 60 FPS, but you know, it's hard to optimize games, right? As we've seen, we either don't get enough time put into these games, or even with stuff like Baldur's Gate 3, which is getting tons and tons of rave reviews, when you get to the city of Baldur's Gate later in the game actually gets less optimized as it goes on. So when you get to that city, it's super CPU intensive, and a lot of people, even with super high-end hardware, are unable to hold 60 FPS, whereas they are in the super optimized parts, which are all in the first act of the game, which was the early access portion of the game. So when you take all of that data and combine it with a lot of the leaks we had from the Microsoft Activision Blizzard situation, where court documents basically revealed the time frame in which the console would come out, I'm fully expecting the PS6 to come out in the fall of 2027. Now right now it's only 2023. We're getting the PS5 Pro in 2024. That's a solid 3 years of time that you have with the Pro model, which makes me think it's going to be worth upgrading to, and that would keep the console generation at around 7 years, which is pretty standard. The longest generation that we've had so far in my lifetime, at least, is the PS3 and 360 generation, but I already explained that that was because of the recession and it went on way longer than it should have. So having a 7-year life cycle with the console is great, But the big problem people consistently bring up, which I totally agree with, is that the PS5 was pretty much unavailable for the first 2 years of its life cycle. So you're basically shaving off 2 years, and that would make it a 5-year life cycle. I think this generation has a lot more cross-gen games than ones we've seen in the past, whereas you'd get a big hardware leap. And the games you would have on the PS2 versus the PS3 would have to be completely different just because you had so much more power between the PS2 and PS3. Whereas this time around, the power jump isn't that massive. It's just numbers on paper, really. And the big features that we're seeing are running these last-gen games at 60 FPS, getting light ray tracing, and running games up to 4K with upscalers like FSR 2.0. So yeah, to answer the question, should you wait for the PS6? I would definitely say not to. I think now is honestly the best time to buy a PlayStation 5 we've had yet. You can get it right now for around $50 off. You can get them used for good prices as well. There's a big library of games. Even though they are cross-gen games, they're going to look and run the best on PS5, and I could not imagine going back and playing something like God of War Ragnarok at 30 FPS knowing that I had an option available with the PS5 that would run it at around 4K 60, because that game looked visually stunning. And on top of all of that, we're really finally starting to see games that actually push the hardware. The one console you might want to consider waiting for, if you're fine with your PS4 Pro, or you have a gaming PC or an Xbox Series S or Nintendo Switch that can kind of hold you over, is the PS5 Pro, because I think when that thing comes out, the big upgrade path with that is going to be running games like Jedi Survivor and Final Fantasy 16 at 60 FPS instead of 30. And as someone who plays a lot of games on PC, that's going to be a very worthy upgrade for me. I love playing games at 60 FPS, but I understand the limitations of a console that only costs $500, and I honestly appreciate it when devs are saying, hey, we have a vision for this game that's going to make it easier to run at 30 FPS, and we'd rather you have a consistent experience than one that's flying all over the place with frame rate. But it is good that they give people the option to switch into performance mode. All right, next up here, let's talk about the PlayStation 5 sales figures, because we just heard from Sony that they're not happy with the 40 million PS5s that have been sold, and I genuinely don't know how they're not happy with it, because up until now, PS5s have been selling literally as fast as they could make them. So it's really their fault for not being able to make enough PS5s when the demand was super high. And the only reason, like we've talked about in a lot of videos lately, that people maybe aren't going out and buying a PlayStation 5 right now is because they don't feel like there are enough games to take advantage of it. And we've had so many confirmed leaks about the PS5 Pro coming next year, they're probably sitting there like, hey, if I wait, I'm gonna get rewarded for it. And with stuff like PS Plus Extra and Premium, where you get this huge library of games, including PS5 games at this point, you only get rewarded the longer you wait to buy new hardware. But despite all that, the PS5 is selling really well. It's on pace with the PlayStation 4, which is really good considering how difficult it was for Sony to get the PS5 out into the wild. You could kind of make the case that this thing is outselling the PS4 technically, because if you had more PS5s available when the thing launched, it would probably be doing a lot better than the PS4. But on top of all of that, it looks like the PS5 isn't slowing down in nearly as much as Sony thinks it is, because in July, sales were up 244% year over year. And you also have to consider that even though it's a smaller number, it was up in sales 23% in June, which I think is really good. And with games like Baldur's Gate 3 coming out on September 6th and Spider-Man coming out in October, on top of every other game that's releasing in the back half of the year, I think these sales are just going to continue to increase, especially when you consider that the PS5 Slim is rumored to release at the end of the year. And that's going to be a twofold hit for Sony, because some people are going to want to get the brand new console on Black Friday with whatever bundle they have available. But then you're going to have people who say, hey, this thing isn't that different from the launch PS5. I could save a little bit of money either buying one used or going and getting an older bundle that will definitely be discounted when the new console is out, because Sony's going to want to clear out that old stock to make room for the brand new PlayStation 5 that's coming out later this year. So if they count the sales combined, which they totally will, because with the PS4, they just did overall PlayStation 4 sales, including the Slim, Original, and Pro, I think it's going to look a lot better for their projections of the future, which is just great for us overall, because Sony making more money on consoles means they have more money to invest into awesome games. And if they keep releasing games like God of War Ragnarok, Horizon Forbidden West, Spider-Man 2 that are single player and not online based, and they keep doing as well as they have, that also continues to incentivize Sony to keep making those games, which is good, because as we all know, in the near future, they're going to be focusing heavily on making live service games. And it seems like people are already kind of not about that, because the two that they've announced have two of the lowest rated PlayStation trailers ever. And I'm sure Sony's not happy about that, because the only reason we're not getting Days Gone 2 is because because of the Metacritic score. That game sold really well. It had some good fan reception, but because critics kind of made up their mind about it before they even played it, the sequel was not greenlit. So when you have Sony caring that much about Metacritic scores, seeing the downvotes on these live service game trailers, it's probably making them pretty upset internally because they have a very high watermark in terms of Metacritic scores, fan reception, and even just critic reception as a whole. People really like PlayStation, and it would really suck to see them tarnish that legacy. And even around Thanksgiving and Christmas, I was seeing them in the store. Like, people weren't fighting to get them or anything like that, and you could just go to Target and buy a PlayStation 5. So overall, I think we're finally hitting the point where enough PS5s are getting out there where Sony can finally move on from the PS4 and we can start getting some true next-gen games, which is the ultimate thing that I think everybody wants. Next up, we're almost in September, so Sony has announced the games that are going to be leaving PS Plus Extra, and there are some surprises on the list, so I thought it was worth bringing up. So the first game that's leaving PS Plus Extra's library on September 18th is Deathloop, which is crazy considering that at one point this was a PlayStation 5 exclusive. And if you look at the review scores, I think it's a lot of copium because I really like this game. I beat it, I 100%ed it, I played it multiple times. I would not rate it anywhere near a 10 out of 10. And this is not me being a PlayStation 5 fanboy, because in my heart, I'm a Bethesda and Arcane fanboy. I played all of their games day one except for Redfall because that game was just such a mess. And even I am like, Deathloop did not deserve a 10 out of 10, but still, it's crazy to see a game that was once a PlayStation 5 exclusive being removed from PS Plus Extra, which, to be fair, we have seen before with Spider-Man Remastered. That was on there a while and they eventually took it off, so it's not unprecedented. It just is a little weird because I don't feel like Deathloop is selling all that many copies. I'm sure it's just a situation where Sony doesn't want to continue licensing the game from Microsoft now that they own Bethesda and in turn Arcane. Two Ubisoft games that also don't really make sense to be leaving are Ghost Recon Wildlands and Watch Dogs 2. Both of these games have a lot of DLC and stuff, so you could kind of see like people downloading Wildlands on the PlayStation Plus Extra library and maybe upgrading to have all of the DLC. But yeah, it doesn't make much sense for that game to leave PS Plus Extra because it is pretty old. And then also Ghost Recon Wildlands, that's another one where I'm like, why would you not just pay the licensing fee on that? I'm sure a lot of people are playing it. It's an open world game that has full co-op, and a lot of people like it a lot more than Ghost Recon Breakpoint, but hey, they're removing that as well. And then there's a bunch of other random games on the list, but yeah, this really just highlights the biggest problem with PS Plus Extra and having these libraries of games. Unlike with PS Plus Essential, where as long as you're paying for PS Plus, you can access these games in perpetuity forever, PS Plus Extra can take these games away at any given time. And I would expect that leading up to new entries in series like Spider-Man 2, as we saw, or Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart sequel, Sony will remove these games from the service, or they could add them as a benefit to say, hey, if you want to know what's going on in the Ratchet & Clank universe, you can just play the last game for free on PS Plus Extra. And the last thing I wanted to talk about today is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game. I put about 10 hours into it over the weekend with my friend Grayson. He's the guy I play all the horror games I play with, and we had so much fun. I'm friends with a lot of the people over at Gun Media, and as glitchy as their last game, Friday the 13th, was, you cannot argue the fact that they understand the horror licenses they take on better than any developer in the industry. I think the only developer that I've personally seen that actually gets close is Saber Interactive with the Evil Dead game, but even that, the maps didn't really look and feel like Michigan. They felt like New Zealand, and it felt like them repurposing assets, where in Friday the 13th it had less maps overall, but they felt like you were existing within the movies, and I'd argue that that's more important. So leading up to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, I was really excited to see that there was no lawsuit that was really going to screw it up, because one guy owns all the rights to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and unless he just wants to take it away, it doesn't seem like anything like that's going to happen anytime soon. And B, I was also excited to see them work with a new developer called Sumo, who's actually worked on a lot of Sony games in the past, so there is a connection between this game and Sony first party, or second party, I guess, which is really cool. So this is an asymmetrical horror game, which if you played Dead by Daylight, Friday the 13th, or Evil Dead, you kind of know what you're getting into here. But the big difference between this game and Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th is that there are multiple killers. So you have Leatherface, you have the cook, you have the hitchhiker, and then there's a girl character who's in like a black Art Deco style dress, and she is absolutely terrifying. I think she's like the coolest new addition to the game. I liked playing as her quite a bit. And this is the first time where I've played one of these games where I really wanted to play as the killer a little bit, and it is a ton of fun. When you're playing as the killer, what you're doing is going around the map and trying to collect blood. So there are blood bags where you get 20 blood and you can hold up to 100 at a time. But if you kill a survivor, you get 100 blood automatically. And when you have that blood, you take it to Grandpa, who's like the guy you think is dead at the dinner table in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, but then it turns out he's alive, and you feed feed him the blood, and once you level him up, he lets out a scream, and if any of the survivors move, it shows where they are on the map, which is pretty powerful, right? There are only 3 maps, but just like with Friday the 13th, they're extremely detailed and make you feel like you're in the movie, so I like the quality over quantity approach, and there will definitely be more maps in the future, so I'm not really too worried about that. Every match starts in the basement when you're a survivor or a killer, and the survivors have to figure out a way to open the basement door, but once they leave, that automatically activates Grandpa. So you can collect a lot of blood knowing that the survivors are going to leave the basement pretty much immediately, and then you can automatically level up Grandpa to level 2, and when you get him to level 4, that's what you really want, because he screams every 30 seconds and they can't stand still to hide from his scream, so it really closes down the match quick, right, when you can see everyone all over the map. Once me and my friend Grayson got our first victory towards the end of the night, it felt so good. Like, honestly, it felt better than any victory I've gotten in Dead by Daylight, Friday the 13th, or Evil Dead. Like, that was a hard fought victory, and it really felt like I was in the Texas Chainsaw universe. Technically speaking, this game runs great on PS5 and PC. The only issue I've seen is that sometimes when killers will actually get their kill animation going, it'll drop a lot of frames and it'll stutter. It seems to be a network issue just from them being overwhelmed by this game being on Game Pass. I feel like a lot more people downloaded it than they anticipated, and I did notice as the weekend went on that it did get better, so I'm assuming they'll be able to patch that really quick. But when you compare this game's launch to the launch of Friday the 13th, it's like night and day. So you can actually go pick this game up right now. There are physical copies. I think it's only $40, but there are a couple DLC packs that add character skins and some kills for Leatherface, which there are a lot of brutal ones in the game and I really like them, but I bought the DLC packs just to give Gun Media my support because I really like that studio. There's a lot more I could get into, like leveling up characters and skill trees and everything like that, but I think it's honestly worth discovering that stuff for yourself, because the learning process of learning how to escape and also learning how to be a killer was kind of like a meta game in itself, so I'm not really going to go too deep into that here. Cannot recommend this game enough if you're into horror movies like I am and you're looking for something a little bit different than Dead by Daylight, which totally stands on its own. I cannot recommend buying this game enough. Anyway guys, that's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.